Hi, you have legs and arms. Pretty cool, right? You can run, you can jump, and you can climb on stuff. Also, everyone is fighting each other. How did this happen? A long time ago, also nowhere, but also everywhere, humans decided to fight each other. Some allowed kicks, and some preferred punches. Their styles are very different and they're far away from each other, but they're getting closer together. And they're getting closer together. And they're getting closer together. Okay, new shit just got made. The Emperor of China fights some demon for the first ever championship of the world and the entirety of China. You have pancration over in Greece. They allowed everything except biting and poking in the eyes. So that's pretty thoughtful, I'd say. China also invented their own version of it, inspired by a big panda or something. Martial arts update. Over in Thailand, they had the idea of using elbows and knees in their fights. It's now the early 1800s. Martial arts are becoming actual sports with proper competitions. Everyone is mixing the different martial arts and creating even crazier martial arts. First person that combined all the martial arts together was the world famous Bruce Lee, who basically said, do whatever the hell you can, just like in a street fight. Okay, he didn't say it like that, but you get what I mean. And he made some movies too. Hey look, it's the first ever official MMA fight. They basically tried to settle an old age question. What is the best way to fight if you found yourself at night in a dark alley fighting a bunch of England supporters who just lost the World Cup? Again. Let's call it the tough guy contest. Who has the best fighting style? Me, said everyone. Now they have to prove it. This fresh new sport has basically no rules, not even weight classes or gloves. Some people had the idea of making the first MMA organization. They also had the idea of combining elements of wrestling, boxing, and submission fighting. Shuto still exists today, so that's something. The UFC was created in 1993, and it wasn't founded by Dana White, but by these other guys. The first UFC event happens, UFC 1. It has no rules, no weight classes, and no time limits. Wow, that's raw and brutal. What a spectacle. Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu fighter Royce Gracie becomes the tournament star. He's defeating all these guys while they are much bigger than him. Some say the term MMA was created by this guy during UFC 1. Some say the name was created by UFC referee Joe McCarthy. He was a cop at the time, so he missed work to be a referee for UFC 1. Where were you last Friday, John? Don't say referee, don't say referee. I was a referee at a martial arts event. Which martial art? All of them together. A mixed martial arts event. Anyways, let me go grab some water. Oh shit, we just missed the first ever submission in MMA history. The Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu guy defeated this other guy with a rear naked choke during the semifinals. And Royce becomes the first UFC champion ever. In an early UFC fight, Keith Hackney repeatedly punched Joe's son in the balls, which was a legal move back then. People called it the most brutal low blow in MMA history. In the coming years, rules were introduced to make fights safer and more regulated. They finally added weight classes and timed rounds. Oh, and women's fighting's a thing now. Wake up, bro. The women's fight is over. Oh, okay, thank you, bro. Also, Joe Rogan is now a commentator at the UFC. You know, the bald podcast guy that shot Elon Musk's car with a bow. But the UFC is a huge failure. People are watching, but we aren't making any money. We'll worry about that later. Have you seen these knockouts? Wow. The longest fight in MMA history happens in Japan. The fight at the Pride Championship between these two guys lasted a full 90 minutes before this guy won by a technical knockout. At UFC 30, a fighter named Tito Ortiz was having a big fight against Evan Tanner, but the UFC still broke. Alright, what do you think of this? We hold the fight, but we won't pay you. What do you mean? Yeah, we just won't pay you. We keep all the money. That didn't sit right with Tito's manager, so he called up some of his friends and decided to buy the UFC. It's a great company you guys got here, valued at over $40 million. People love it. Best I can do is $2 million. And then they accepted his offer. Anyways, even after Joe Rogan bought the UFC, they weren't making any money. Wait. Joe Rogan didn't buy the UFC. Oh yeah, my bad. The other bald guy. They were still not making any money. They were actually $40 million in debt. So that's a minor issue. In 2002, at Pride 21, these guys had one of the most iconic fights in MMA history. The two fighters grabbed each other by the back of their heads and started spamming punches towards each other's face, literally standing toe to toe in the corner of the ring. This American cowboy ultimately won via a technical knockout. The UFC's big breakthrough came in 2005 with a UFC reality TV show. Yep. I'm not joking. In The Ultimate Fighter, a bunch of amateur fighters had to compete in a tournament and the winner got a professional contract with the UFC. The tournament ended in a fight between Forrest Griffin and Stephan Bonner at UFC 62. This fight was a total war. These two guys were beating the living hell out of each other. No one had an upper hand over the other. They were perfectly matched. Bro, turn on the TV. These two guys are beating the living hell out of each other. So many people all over the world just wanted to see two regular guys beat each other up, and the event snowballed into around 500,000 pay-per-views. At the end, both fighters were contracted because they literally saved the UFC. After this event, MMA exploded in popularity. The 2000s saw new legends like Chuck Liddell, Randy Couture, and George St-Pierre. Chuck Liddell had this incredible knockout power which fans loved, and he became one of the UFC's first crossover stars. Anderson Silva, known as the Spider, became the UFC middleweight champion in 2006. He held this title for a record-breaking 2,457 days, making him one of the greatest fighters of all time. George St-Pierre and Anderson Silva are some of the best pound-for-pound fighters in the world, and many people still argue they are some of the greatest fighters of all time. The first MMA event to sell 1 million pay-per-views was UFC 66. The event was centered around a rematch between Chuck Liddell and Tito Ortiz. Liddell won the fight by a technical knockout in the third round, successfully defending his title. At the time, Dana White and Tito Ortiz had some beef, so when Chuck Liddell won, Dana asked for his shorts and gloves and kept them as a trophy to piss Tito Ortiz off. In 2008, Brock Lesnar, a former WWE wrestler, joins the UFC and becomes really popular. Also, the new generation of fighters are now popping up. Fighters like Jon Jones, Conor McGregor, and Khabib Nurmagomedov. Nurmagomedov. Oh, and women are now part of the UFC. Ronda Rousey became the first female fighter to sign. Bro, how is this guy sleeping again? UFC 100 saw 1.6 million pay-per-views, the most any event had ever done. It was a huge fight between Brock Lesnar and Frank Mir, but also George St-Pierre and Thiago Alves in the same fight. It was like having two main events in one. At UFC 128, Jon Jones became the UFC light heavyweight champion, making history as the youngest MMA champion ever. Then in UFC 182, Jon Jones was challenged by an Olympic gold medalist, Daniel Cormier, two of the best fighters in the heavyweight division. Jones ultimately won the fight. Two guys had the idea of having the most boring MMA fight in history. It was a really boring idea. Silva was known as one of the most spectacular fighters of his era. This fight had no action. Silva avoided all meaningful exchanges, and fighters just stood around, not doing anything. Everyone got so mad at Silva that the whole stadium started booing loudly. Even Dana White said how disappointed he was in the fight. You're awake even with the most boring fight in history, but if a woman entered the Diaz brothers, Nick and Nate Diaz. Nate had a legendary fight against Conor McGregor at UFC 196. Nate was supposed to be the underdog, but he submitted Conor in the second round and dropped the legendary line,
"Hey, I'm not surprised, mother."
He proved that even the loudest trash talkers can get humbled. They then had a massive rematch at UFC 202, which broke pay-per-view records and became one of the biggest fights in MMA history. The Diaz brothers built a cult following with their anti-establishment attitude and street fighting style. Demetrius Mighty Mouse Johnson is also considered one of the greatest MMA fighters of all time. He became the first ever UFC flyweight champion in 2012, and then he defended the title a record 11 times, dominating the entire division for 6 years. Mighty Mouse is widely regarded as one of the best pound-for-pound fighters ever. James Toney, a famous boxer, left boxing and entered MMA to fight Randy Couture at UFC 118. He claimed boxing was superior to MMA. Toney lasted a little over 3 minutes in the first round against Couture. The fastest knockout in MMA history occurred in 2010 during a King of the Cage fight. This guy knocked out this other guy in just 3 seconds of the first round. Not many people know that knockout since it wasn't in the UFC. But now you know, I guess. The fastest knockout in the UFC happened in UFC 239.
They get the fight clock is brought to you by Modelo.
George Masvidal knocked out Ben Askren with a flying knee in just 5 seconds. Masvidal's win earned him the BMF belt. McGregor made history by becoming the first fighter to hold 2 UFC titles simultaneously, earning the title of double champ. For the press conference leading up to UFC 205, Conor McGregor fully roasted Jeremy Stephens, who interrupted him to claim he had the hardest hits in the division. Conor looked confused and replied,
"Who the fuck is that guy? Who the fuck is that?"
It's safe to say that McGregor was one of the biggest trash talkers in MMA history, and he might only compare to Chael Sonnen, who was known as the king of trash talk. Some of his lines were so absurd they became unintentionally funny. One of his most famous was,
"I don't care, I don't promote fights, I pick fights. I'm like John Jones, I sound like Sean Combs, and I got trombone-sized stones like John Holmes."
At UFC 214, Jon Jones and Daniel Cormier had their highly anticipated rematch, even after Jon Jones was expelled from the UFC multiple times. Why was he expelled? Let's take a look. Drug use, drunk driving, domestic violence, tampering with vehicles, battery, sexual assault, headbutting a police car, and firing a gun while intoxicated. Anyways, Jon Jones defeated Cormier that night. However, the biggest MMA event of all time remains UFC 229. The main event, Khabib Nurmagomedov versus Conor McGregor. They had some huge personal beef. McGregor was insulting Khabib's religion, Russian background, and even his wife as a part of his trash talk. It became the most watched MMA event in history, selling over 2.4 million pay-per-views. Khabib won the fight via submission as Conor tapped out in the 4th round. Khabib then fought a couple more times and then shocked the world by announcing his retirement in 2020 due to the passing of his father, who was also his coach. Khabib remains undefeated with a perfect score of 29 wins and 0 losses, one of the very few fighters who have ever achieved this. The only fighter that comes close would be
Jon Jones is absolutely positively the pound-for-pound best fighter in the world.
With 27 wins and only 1 official loss, which remains controversial. He got disqualified by a small technicality while winning a fight against Matt Hamill back in 2009. Anyways, Bellator was created in 2008 and is still to this day the biggest competitor to the UFC. Over the years, several famous UFC fighters have left and joined Bellator. Guys like Tito Ortiz, Quinton Rampage Jackson, Eddie Alvarez, and many others. Rampage Jackson joined Bellator in 2013 because he just didn't like the UFC contract. He then won against King Mo Lawo at Bellator 120. Enter Fedor Emelianenko, aka the Last Emperor, one of MMA's most legendary figures. This Russian heavyweight wasn't just good, he was unstoppable. From 2000 to 2010, Fedor went undefeated for nearly an entire decade. He was always calm, emotionless, and stoic, which made him even scarier. He wasn't flashy, no trash talk, but he knocked out everyone that tried to take his spot. His famous fight against Mirko Cro Cop was one of the most anticipated MMA fights of all time. Fedor won that fight too, and then when he left, he joined the Russian government in the Council of Fitness and Sports, so that's pretty significant, I'd say. Bellator has a bunch of other iconic fights, like Bellator 58, between these guys, which is considered one, if not the best fights in Bellator history. Another significant Bellator fight was between Fedor Emelianenko, the Russian guy who works at the government, versus Ryan Bader in Bellator 214. Fedor was near the end of his career and was way past his prime. He lost that fight to Bader in just 35 seconds. Somewhere in Spain, a guy starts training in some torn down gym. Don't mind him, but he might just be about to become one of the best MMA fighters in the world. Anyways, over in the world of kickboxing, Alex Pereira, a well-known Brazilian kickboxer, fights Israel Adesanya twice, beating him both times. Israel Adesanya leaves kickboxing and joins the UFC, becoming the champion in 2018. It was all good until Adesanya started running his mouth about Pereira.
He watches all my fights, and every time I fight, like clockwork, he'll try and put something out like, I beat this guy. At the end of the day, no one knows who the f he is, and he's gonna be that guy when I'm world champion, when I'm a legend. He's gonna be at some pub talking some shit about, I beat that guy one time.
So then Pereira had to join the UFC to shut him up, which he did at UFC 281. They then had a rematch at UFC 287, and this time, after 3 failed attempts, Adesanya finally won. Khabib is now also training another Dagestani fighter, Islam Makhachev, who has already won and defended his lightweight title 3 times. UFC 300 turned out to be one of the best fight cards in UFC history. Max Holloway knocked out this guy and was awarded the BMF title. Alex Pereira then knocked out this other guy, and Charles Oliveira lost to Arman Sarukian. It was a crazy fight card, and it became the most pay-per-view watched fight card of 2024. Jon Jones came back to the UFC after recovering from a chest injury and then beat one of the greatest heavyweights of all time, Stipe Miocic. Now, Jon Jones is set to fight Tom Aspinall for the heavyweight world championship in 2025. A Spanish fighter named Ilia Topuria, aka El Matador, defeats these great fighters and becomes, together with Alex Pereira, one of the best fighters of 2024. Anyways, why isn't MMA in the Olympics yet?